The dim light of the upscale Manhattan restaurant cast long shadows across the polished marble floors and glistening glassware, but none of it could soften the cold tension that hung thick in the air. David Harris sat rigidly at the corner table, his sharp eyes scanning every movement with the precision of a man used to commanding empires. The clinking of crystal and murmurs of polite conversation around him felt distant and irrelevant, like echoes from a world he had built but no longer truly belonged to. Beside him, Ben, his 10-year-old son, struggled against the invisible chains of his own body. The metal brace encasing half of his leg was a stark reminder of the accident that had shattered more than just his bones. David watched as Ben's fingers trembled slightly, gripping the edge of the table, the silent frustration of a child trapped inside a body that refused to cooperate. There was so much David wanted to say, so much advice and caution, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say to help the boy who looked up to him with such quiet courage, yet remained confined by his own limitations? Across the room, Emma Carter moved effortlessly through the tables, her presence unassuming yet unmistakably strong. Her skin glowed warmly under the restaurant's muted lighting, a contrast to the polished sterility of the surroundings. Emma's smile was genuine, though her eyes carried the weight of unseen battles, an invisible toughness forged through years of struggle. To David, she was just another server, another face in the crowd, but to Ben, she was something else entirely. Ben's gaze followed her as she approached their table, the hint of a hopeful smile flickering across his lips. The music had changed. A soft piano melody now filled the room, delicate and inviting. Ben's eyes brightened, a small spark of life breaking through the shadows of pain. Without a word, he looked up at his father, a silent question lingering in his eyes. "Can I?" David's expression hardened. The thought of his son dancing in this place, of him moving beyond the rigid rules and careful steps he had imposed, was unsettling. "Ben, this isn't the place," he said quietly but firmly. "People are watching. This is a restaurant, not a stage." But Ben's determination was unshakable. He looked back at Emma, who had paused just a few feet away, waiting with a patient smile. There was a vulnerability in Ben's stance, a quiet plea for freedom that David hadn't seen before. The boy was asking for more than a dance. He was asking to be seen, to be understood beyond the braces and the limitations. Emma stepped closer, her eyes locking with David's for a fleeting moment. There was no judgment there, only recognition. Slowly, she removed the apron from her waist and set it on the nearby chair, a silent declaration that for this moment, she was not a server bound by rules, but a partner in something more profound. Ben reached out a tentative hand, and Emma took it without hesitation. The music swelled slightly, wrapping around them like a gentle embrace. For a brief moment, the restaurant faded away, the polished tables, the watching eyes, the unspoken expectations. There was only the movement, the rhythm of two souls finding connection in the most unexpected of places. David felt a strange stir in his chest, a mixture of pride, fear, and something he couldn't name. Watching his son lead with such quiet strength, refusing to be defined by his injury, challenged everything he believed about control and protection. As the music carried them forward, David realized that perhaps this dance was not just for Ben. It was for all of them, a fragile step toward healing and hope. "If you'd like, I can continue or expand on other parts." David sat back in his chair once the music faded and the last note lingered like a fragile echo in the air. His breath came slower now, his eyes fixed on Ben and Emma still standing by the table, their faces flushed with a mixture of exhilaration and shy embarrassment. The other diners had returned to their meals and conversations, but David's mind was elsewhere, caught in a storm of conflicting emotions that he couldn't easily name. For years, David had built his life around control. Control over his business, his image, and above all, over his son's world. Ben's accident had been a breaking point, not just physically but emotionally, and in the aftermath, David's protectiveness had hardened into something unyielding, almost suffocating. He thought he was shielding Ben from harm, from disappointment, from the unpredictable chaos of a world that seemed cruel to those who were vulnerable. But now, watching Ben move with a quiet grace that defied his injury, David felt the brittle walls around his heart begin to crack. The seed of doubt had been planted the moment Ben took Emma's hand, the simple act of trust and courage illuminating everything David had been trying to suppress. It was as if the boy was quietly teaching his father to see beyond fear, beyond limitation, to a place where hope could still take root. David's thoughts spiraled back to the countless hours spent in sterile hospital rooms, the relentless therapy sessions, the quiet frustration on Ben's face as he struggled to reclaim parts of himself that injury had tried to steal. He had been so focused on the end goal, recovery, normalcy, that he had missed the small victories along the way, the moments when Ben's spirit danced free even if his body faltered. David's eyes softened as he looked at his son now, a mixture of pride and guilt warring within him. Pride because Ben had shown a bravery that few could muster, a resilience that no brace or scar could define. Guilt because he had not always seen it, because his fear had sometimes made him blind to the boy's true strength. He realized with a painful clarity that in trying to protect Ben from pain, he had also kept him from the chance to feel joy, to risk failure, to grow. Emma returned to the table with a gentle smile, a quiet understanding in her gaze that needed no words. She handed Ben a small folded note, a gesture of friendship, of connection beyond the roles they played in this glossy restaurant. Ben's face lit up as he read it, the simple promise of tomorrow's dance lingering in his eyes like a beacon. David felt a stirring of something unfamiliar, a hope that perhaps the future held more than the rigid plans he had so carefully mapped out. The evening wore on, but David found himself unable to fully engage with the conversation around him. His thoughts circled endlessly back to the image of his son standing there, unafraid and alive, and to Emma, the woman who had sparked something gentle and unexpected inside both of them. He questioned everything he thought he knew about strength and protection, about what it meant to be a father. In that quiet moment, David made a silent vow to himself. He would try to loosen the tight grip of fear and control that had dominated their lives for so long. He would learn to trust in Ben's resilience, to embrace the unpredictability of life rather than resist it. It was a beginning, uncertain and fragile, but perhaps the most important step he could take as a father. As they left the restaurant, the cool night air wrapping around them like a balm, David felt the weight on his chest ease just a little. The world outside was still daunting, still unpredictable, but for the first time in a long while, he sensed a sliver of something precious, possibility. The sterile fluorescent lights of the corporate office buzzed overhead, cold and unyielding, much like the world David thought he had mastered. Yet, as he entered the gleaming lobby, the familiar hum of ambition and calculation felt heavier than ever, pressing down on his chest like an unseen weight. The polished floors reflected his tense figure, a man both in command and quietly unraveling beneath the surface. He had come here expecting routine, meetings, numbers, decisions, but today the air carried something different, a charged undercurrent he couldn't yet name. His assistant, always punctual and efficient, led him through the maze of glass-walled offices to a conference room bathed in muted daylight. Inside, waiting with a calm demeanor, was a figure he hadn't seen in years. Olivia Marks. Once a rising star in the industry, Olivia's presence now stirred a complex mixture of admiration and unease in David. Her eyes, sharp and probing, held a glint that suggested she was about to upend the careful balance of his world. "David," Olivia began, her voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge, "I won't waste time on pleasantries. We both know why I'm here." She placed a slim folder on the table, its weight symbolic of the proposal contained within. David's pulse quickened. The world they inhabited thrived on power plays, veiled threats and unspoken bargains, yet this moment felt different, intimate in its intensity, raw in its implications. He opened the folder slowly, the crisp papers revealing projections, contracts, and an unexpected opportunity, a joint venture that could redefine his career, a chance to rebuild what had begun to crumble. But the proposal came with conditions, not merely financial or strategic, but deeply personal. Olivia was asking for trust, a collaboration that required David to let down the walls he had so meticulously constructed. The offer was an invitation to vulnerability, a surrender of control that terrified him. As he looked up, Olivia's gaze met his with unwavering resolve. "This is more than business, David. It's about redemption. About reclaiming what we lost." "What you lost? I see the way you're holding back. The fear. The guilt. It's in your eyes." Her words struck him harder than any negotiation tactic could. For a moment, the powerful businessman and the guarded father within him collided, exposing the fractures he had tried to conceal. The echo of his son's courage from the previous night, the dance, the hope, resurfaced in his mind, a quiet challenge to embrace the unknown. David's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, knuckles pale with the force of his internal struggle. To accept Olivia's offer meant stepping into the light of uncertainty, risking not just his career but the fragile peace he was beginning to build with Ben. Yet to refuse was to retreat into the shadows of fear and isolation. He swallowed hard, the room shrinking around him as he faced a choice that transcended business strategy. It was a crossroads between who he had been and who he might become, between control and surrender, between solitude and connection. Finally, his voice broke the silence, low but resolute. "I'll take the risk," he said. "Not just for the business, but for everything I'm trying to rebuild." Olivia smiled, a mixture of relief and satisfaction. "Good. Because this is only the beginning." As David left the conference room, the folder clutched tightly in his hand, the sterile office felt less cold, less unyielding. The journey ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges and shadows, but beneath the surface, a flicker of hope had been kindled. A hope that maybe, just maybe, the hardest battles were those fought within, and the greatest victories came from daring to let go. The sleek black car glided to a stop in front of the low, modern building labeled Freedom Steps. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, its golden light falling unevenly on the worn pavement and freshly painted walls. David sat in the driver's seat, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm against the leather steering wheel, while beside him, Ben watched the entrance with a quiet mix of anticipation and apprehension. The name, Freedom Steps, had always sounded like a promise, a hope wrapped in metaphor, a pathway out of confinement, both physical and mental. Yet, as David took in the building's sterile facade, a part of him bristled with unease. This was the place where his son would face the long, grueling work of reclaiming not just his mobility, but his independence. It was a place of transformation, but also of vulnerability, and the thought unsettled him more than he was willing to admit. Ben's eyes met his father's, searching for reassurance. David forced a smile, though it felt brittle, like cracked glass stretched thin over a hollow core. "Ready?" he asked softly. Ben nodded, but the hesitation lingered in the tense set of his shoulders. The accident had left more than scars. It had carved out a new reality, one that neither of them fully understood yet. The familiar world had shifted beneath their feet, and each step forward felt precarious, weighted with invisible burdens. Inside the center, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and fresh paint, mingling with the soft murmur of conversations and the rhythmic tapping of footsteps on polished floors. Therapists and patients moved through the space with a practiced calm that belied the intense struggles beneath their composed exteriors. David followed Ben's lead, aware of the silent spotlight their presence cast, the successful businessman and his injured son entering a world of healing and hardship. The first session began with simple exercises, designed to coax muscles into movement and minds into focus. David watched as Ben pushed against resistance bands, his face etched with concentration and occasional flashes of frustration. It was a painful reminder of how much had been lost, how far they still had to go. Yet beneath the surface of struggle, there was also resilience. Ben's determination sparked something in David that he hadn't felt in months, a flicker of hope that refused to be extinguished. The boy's willingness to fight, to endure, even when the progress was agonizingly slow, challenged David's own fears and doubts. He realized that healing was not a destination but a process, messy, unpredictable, and deeply human. Between sessions, David found moments to sit quietly, wrestling with his own emotions. Guilt gnawed at him, For the times he had been too absorbed in his work to be truly present, for the moments when fear had clouded his judgment, for the unspoken distance that had grown between them. But alongside the guilt was a growing sense of responsibility. Not just as a provider, but as a father who needed to listen, to support, to be vulnerable himself. Ben caught his father's gaze during a break, offering a tentative smile that held more meaning than words ever could. In that brief exchange, David saw the fragile bridge beginning to form between them, built not on perfection, but on acceptance and trust. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the center's windows in shades of purple and gold, David and Ben stepped outside together. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges they could not yet foresee. But for the first time in a long while, David felt the weight of fear begin to lift, replaced by a cautious optimism. They were, he thought, taking the first true steps toward freedom, not just from injury, but from the shadows that had kept them apart. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to carry them forward. Weeks passed. Freedom Steps became a second home for both David and Ben, a place where bodies strained against limits, and minds were quietly reforged in pain and perseverance. The early days of therapy had been steep climbs, each task a summit, each session a small battle. But slowly, the terrain began to shift. The winces became grit. The frustration, focus. And for David, the tight grip of helplessness was replaced by something sharper, clearer: purpose. The quiet hours spent in the rehabilitation center had started to awaken something in him. Not just the dormant fatherhood he had neglected for years, but an insight into the fragile architecture of human effort. Watching Ben struggle, fail, try again, there was a language in that, a rhythm. It wasn't just about regaining strength. It was about redefining identity. Outside the walls of Freedom Steps, David's business world was rumbling with unease. The market was shifting, competitors circling like wolves sensing weakness. Investors grew impatient, and board meetings were laced with veiled doubts. Olivia's joint venture offer sat on his desk, now revised, waiting for his final commitment. But David had changed. The man they expected to respond, quick, sharp, strategic to a fault, was no longer sitting behind the mahogany desk. He was beside a boy learning to stand again. He began to see things differently. Patterns emerged where before there had only been noise. He started spending his nights not just reviewing reports, but listening, to Ben, to the therapists, to Olivia. A picture formed, slow and layered. The rehabilitation center was more than a place of healing. It was a model, intimate, personal, resilient. And it was underfunded, underutilized, underestimated. The breakthrough came not in a boardroom, but during a quiet moment in the therapy room. Ben, drenched in sweat, had finally taken 4 full steps with minimal support. They were wobbly, strained, but they were his. David had watched the room erupt in cautious celebration, his heart thudding against his ribs like a drum of war and relief. Ben had turned toward him, eyes lit with something fierce and unspoken. "I'm not going back to who I was," the boy had said. "I want to move forward. Whatever that looks like." That night, David didn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table, the lights low, the house quiet, and he redrew everything: the business, the model, the plan. He reached out to Olivia at dawn. "We go beyond the joint venture," he told her over coffee in a booth downtown. "We don't just build another corporate rehab wing. We invest in a network. Real healing. Real stories. Data-backed, human-centered. Centers like Freedom Steps, scaled but not sterilized." Olivia had blinked, surprised. "This is not what I expected." "I'm not who I was," he said simply. They began assembling a team, not just consultants and finance experts, but therapists, patients, people who had lived the struggle. Ben's progress became the blueprint for a new approach, one that combined clinical science with emotional intelligence. They designed a strategy where the business model was inseparable from the impact, each center to be tailored, not franchised, scalable but still breathing. Ben, watching this unfold, was no longer just the patient. David began bringing him into conversations. He would sit quietly during meetings, listening, absorbing. His presence alone reminded the team of what was at stake. He had become the soul of the project, the reason behind the spreadsheets. The business world took notice. David's return was not a comeback in the traditional sense. It was a transformation. What once had been a pursuit of dominance became a pursuit of relevance, of legacy. Investors who had once doubted now leaned in. Olivia's trust in him evolved into genuine respect, and perhaps, something more complicated that neither dared define just yet. At the center, Ben's steps grew stronger. He no longer needed the rails. His voice had grown more assertive, his humor returning like sunlight breaking through months of cloud. One afternoon, after a particularly intense session, he looked at his father and said, "You know, I think we're healing at the same pace." David didn't answer right away. His throat tightened. He looked at his son, truly looked at him, and for the first time didn't see fragility or trauma or lost time. He saw a young man becoming whole in real time. "Yeah," David said quietly. "We are." The strategy had become more than numbers. The breakthrough was not just in Ben's stride, but in David's heart, a shift from ambition to meaning, from control to connection. And though the road ahead was long, uncertain, and still laced with shadows, they were now walking it side by side, no longer afraid of the darkness, but guided by the quiet light of rediscovery. Spring came slowly that year. The snow melted reluctantly, leaving behind muddy fields and trees still hesitant to bloom. But inside Freedom Steps, there was a quiet renewal already underway. Something had shifted, not just in the patients but in the walls themselves, in the way light moved through the rooms, in the tone of voices and the energy that pulsed beneath the surface. Ben's steps had become steady now. Not perfect, not without effort, but no longer timid. The boy who had once stared blankly out of hospital windows was gone, replaced by someone still young, still uncertain at times, but undeniably alive. And with each session, each hour spent helping another patient balance or stretch or even smile, it became clear. He wasn't just recovering. He was becoming. David watched from the hallway one morning as Ben helped a new patient, a boy maybe 10, trembling with fear at the sight of parallel bars. Ben crouched down, speaking gently, telling him about his own first day. There was no condescension in his voice, no rehearsed therapist tone. Only shared experience, honest and raw. The boy eventually took a shaky step, gripping Ben's hand like a lifeline. That was when David knew. This place, Freedom Steps, it wasn't just where Ben had healed. It was where Ben belonged. By mid-May, plans for expansion had begun to take shape. What started as David's blueprint had become something more organic, more collaborative. Therapists, former patients, social workers, even skeptics had joined the table. They weren't building a franchise. They were cultivating a movement, one that valued the human spirit as much as clinical outcomes. David made a bold proposal during a late-night meeting in the conference room, surrounded by notes, coffee cups, and tired eyes. "We make Ben a part of the leadership team, not just a face for this project, but a voice. He knows what healing looks like from the inside. He's lived it." There were hesitations, of course. Concerns about youth, about readiness, about risk. But David didn't waver. Neither did Olivia, who had grown increasingly invested, not just in the project, but in the people at its heart. And when Ben stood before the team a week later, delivering a trembling but heartfelt speech about fear, progress, and the dignity of trying, there was no further doubt. He was ready. Life, however, didn't wait for neat conclusions. The past still had a way of creeping in, quiet, uninvited. One evening, Ben found a letter slipped under his door. No return address, just his name handwritten. Inside, a single page. Words from his mother, the first contact in years. Apologies, confessions, fragile attempts at closure. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He simply walked into the woods behind the center, stood beneath a tree, and read the letter twice. Then, folding it with careful hands, he slipped it into his pocket and kept walking. That night, he asked David if he believed in forgiveness. David paused, then answered honestly, "I think Forgiveness is less about excusing the past, and more about freeing the future. Ben nodded slowly. I think I want to try. That conversation became a seed. In the months that followed, Ben reached out to his mother. Carefully, with boundaries but with intention. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't cinematic. But it was real. And sometimes that's enough. The center thrived. The pilot program grew. People came, from neighboring towns, from across the state, some even from overseas. They came not just for therapy, but for something deeper. A space that honored their struggle, that didn't rush healing but walked beside it. And at the heart of it all was a boy with a limp and a smile. A living testament to what was possible when you weren't treated as a diagnosis, but as a person. David, too, changed. The man who once defined himself by deals and dominance now spent his days in smaller rooms, speaking with quieter voices. He still had power, but it no longer consumed him. It served something greater now. And though the old habits tugged at him sometimes, the hunger for speed, control, scale, he had learned to pause, to breathe, to remember the winter when everything fell apart and how spring had come not with grandeur, but with a boy's first trembling step. One afternoon, Ben stood at the front of a packed auditorium during the inauguration of a second Freedom Step Center. He didn't read from a script. He simply looked at the crowd, patients, parents, investors, nurses, and said, "This place didn't save me. It gave me the chance to save myself." There was silence, then applause. And in the back of the room, David leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes shining, knowing that somehow, despite the pain, the detours, the wreckage, they had built something that mattered. A new beginning. Not just for Ben. Not just for the center. But for every broken thing that had once seemed beyond repair.